In this tutorial, you will learn how to create explosions in Maya using the Mesh toolkit. For an object to explode, we need to break it apart into a number of fragments, but it would be tedious to do so manually. So instead of shredding the object manually, we get it to follow a cluster of particles, which causes the object to disintegrate. To create a particle cluster, I'm going to make a simple cube and attach a mesh network to it. To attach a mesh network, first select the FX preset, then go to Mesh and open the Mesh editor. Next, click on the Mesh option again and then create Mesh network. Once we create a cluster, we can modify the cluster's distribution. To modify the distribution, click on Mesh 1 distribute, then go to Mesh 1 underscore distribute, and then change the number of particles you want in the cluster. In this case, I'm going to have 24 particles or 24 cubes in the cluster. And then I'm also going to change the way these particles or cubes are arranged. So I'm going to select the last option, which is volume, and then select sphere. Next, we make the cluster explode by attaching to it an explode node. To create an explode node, go to the Mesh toolkit and then left click on explode and then add explode node. Once we have the explode node, we need to open the outliner and then drag our cube or our particle cluster, drag it with the middle mouse click into the exploding mesh slot. Once we do that, once we add the cube to the exploding mesh slot, we should now be able to add some velocity and initial rotation to these individual particles. So to do so, let's go to the Mesh editor and click on this little icon up here and then select Dynamics. Once we have the Dynamics node in our Mesh network, we can go here and then change the initial velocity. We want these particles to move upward, and that's the reason why we are changing the Y value. So this is X, Y, and Z. And then you can also change the initial rotation velocity. I'm going to change it for all three axes. So 10. And now let's see what it does to our simulation. To see the full animation, we can zoom out and then change the number of frames you can see on the timeline. That way, we can play the animation until the very end. So now what we want to do is, now that we have our particle cluster in place, we want to add the object to the stage that we will be exploding using the Mesh network. So let's go and add a cube to the scene. If you notice up here, next to the faces, it shows that this cube has 6 faces, but our particle cluster has 24 individual particles. To be able to disintegrate this cube in such a way that each face from this cube follows one of these particles, we want to make sure that the cube has 24 faces as well, the same number of faces as the number of particles. So to change the number of faces, go to the channel box, click on Polycube 2, and then increase the number of subdivisions. And that will change the number of faces to 24. Now what we do is we take our cube, which is cube 3, and then plug that into our explode node. Now, if you can't see the explode node right now, you cannot see the explode node in the mesh editor, what you could do is go to Windows, open the node editor. Now, the node editor shows you all of the input and output nodes involved in creating the cluster right here. So to see the nodes, to see the input and output nodes, click on the cluster and then click on this input and output connection. And that reveals all of the different nodes that we have in this network. Now, if you cannot see the explode node, what you could do is select the cluster and click on the input output again. Now you can see the explode node in the node network. So as soon as you click on the explode node in the node editor, you will be able to see the exploding mesh slot once again. So it disappeared in the meantime, and if you struggle to find the explode node, you can go back to the node editor, select the explode node, and then access the exploding mesh slot. And then what you do is you drag the new cube that you want to explode into the exploding mesh slot. Now, if you play the animation at this point, see what happens. So the particle cluster explodes, but the cube remains disintegrated into the same position. It doesn't move at all. So to be able to animate it, to be able to determine how long that animation is going to happen, what you do is you work with this random strength slider. So with the slider, the timeline slider in frame 1, what you do is you move the slider, the random strength slider, all the way to the left, and that brings the faces back to form the cube. Once you have it in the right place, once you have the slider in the right place, you click on random strength and say set key. Now you go to the location where you want the cube to disintegrate. You move the slider all the way up to the right and set key. So now if you play the animation, you'll see the cube explode, but it doesn't behave the same way as the cluster particle. So what we have to do is that we have to go to our node editor and locate two specific nodes in this node editor. So the nodes that we are looking at, they're called, let's first select the exploding mesh and then click on these two. So the nodes that we are looking for are named the explode node, it's called the explode node, and the repro node. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to first of all right click on the repro node and select show all attributes. This will show you all of the input and output points that this repro node has, inputs that it receives, and then the output it sends out to other nodes. Once you expand, you'll be able to see input points slot right here down the middle. What you want to do is you also want to explode the mesh 1 explode node by clicking on this little icon right here and expand the mesh explode node, which shows you the input points option as well. What you do is you click on the input points node under the mesh repro and then drag it on the input points node under the Mesh 1 explode node. Now this should change the way the cube explodes. Okay? So right now what's happening is that when our cube explodes, the individual faces of that cube follow the individual particles in the particle cluster. Now, if you don't want to show the cluster, if you want to make the cluster invisible, there are a couple of ways of doing it. You can select the cluster and go to the channel box right here, and then under display, if you click on the last icon, it will create a new layer and add the particle cluster to that layer. That way, if you don't want the particle cluster to be visible, you can simply click on this first checkbox and turn it off. Now, if you play the animation, all you see is the cube. At this point, if you are happy with what you see, you could go to the cache option at the top, go to Alembic cache, and then export all to Alembic. Or you can select the cube and then select export selection to Alembic. And this should allow you to export your dynamic simulation to Unity.